Thank you, Pastor John. I think, as we are looking at this coming week, as we look at fasting, and this is actually a good introduction today to what we're going to be talking about. Because God is enabling us, we want to stay focused. We want to be attentive. We want to hear the voice of God. It's not destruction or even some mishaps. Like, how many of you believe that God is not shook by this morning's mishap? He's not. But when those things come, it is not some of this stuff that will distract us or that will avoid us from focusing. It basically is actually the distraction. There's so many distractions out there that will get us to the place where we are out of focus. And that is why some of these disciplines, some of these Christian disciplines like fasting and prayer, and it's a good thing that we incorporate this every year and twice a year, that we make sure that we will continue to stay in focus, to stay attentive to what God is saying to us. And you know what, folks? Do you want to see the power of God unleashed? In every way of our ministry, it is staying focused on what God has called us to do. To live out the love of God in such a transforming way that people who are far from God would have the opportunity to see how love is exemplified or lived out, and they can find themselves living a life controlled by the Holy Spirit. And this morning, as we look at the last part of our series, but what I want to do is that if you have your word, if you turn to the book of Judges, we're going to look at the book of Judges, and we're going to be talking about the power of attention, and I think that there is no better way to close off this series on unleashing the power than to talk about unleashing the power of attention. And because last week we've been talking about the life of Gideon, this is basically, if there was actually a part B of that sermon, like part A was last week. So what I want to do is just summarize quickly some points from last week, just quickly, and then we go on to what we're going to be talking about here today. Because last week, we learned that Gideon, under the direction of his commander-in-chief, that he got the green light to go ahead and attack and fight against the enemy of the ruthless Midianites. And we found out last week, they were so ruthless, and they destroyed everything. In fact, even the animals and the cattle, that they destroyed them, and the people were living in fear, and they were digging up in caves and places to hide and to live their homes in them. But first, God showed him that he called up this weakling, reluctant person to start off with, and he said to him, I want you to go out. And God began to introduce the fact that God is saying that I am an innovative power. I have an innovation. I believe in innovation. And so what did God do? He scaled back all of the soldiers and the forces of Gideon. Do you remember how many it was? There was 32,000, right? And then he was facing a formidable force, like in 135,000 people. And God said, okay, you've got a number issue here that we're going to have to scale that back. And I want you to send some people back. And he did. In fact, 22,000 of their 35,000 were sent home. And then you think God said, let me be innovative to you. Let me give you something here for you to think about. So 22,000 went home. Then God said, okay, Gideon, there's still too many. I mean, you never hear this before ever in any military strategy. So they said, send some more home. So he sent some more home. 9,700 left and went home. And 300 people were left. And the ratio was 1 to 450. One person for 450 people. What are the chances? And I read through and we look at this, and never ever in the annals of warfare had the odds been so totally overwhelming. Facing a formidable army of the Midianite, Gideon now has less than 1% of his men remaining. Less than 1%. You see what's happening here? I mentioned to you before, to have an innovation spirit, you're going to have to start from going from all of this traditional thinking, just normal thinking, to an innovative zone where you can think outside of the box. But God is good at that. And he began to do that. He was showing Gideon to move out of that zone of normal thinking to creative, innovative thinking, showing Gideon that one man with God is in the majority. He was proving to Gideon that little can be much when God is in it. Every one of us is a tool in the hands of the master craftsman. God is saying to, what do you have? Me. Give yourself to me. I will do something beautiful out of your life. One person is an audience with God. He's the majority. And now Gideon had 300 men to work with. Again, inspired by the innovation of God's direction and his promise, he began to release the power of innovation in his own life. He came up with a creative plan. Now he got 300 men against 135,000. What is he going to do? So he began to be innovative. He divided the 300 men into 3 companies of 100 men each. He gave each man a ram's horn. Listen to this. It doesn't make sense from a military strategy. He gave each man a ram's horn and a clay jar with a torch in it. And then he said to them, keep your eyes on me as soon as I and those with me blow the ram's horns. All of you what? Shout for the Lord and for Gideon. In other words, we're going to do a surprise attack. So just after midnight, they surrounded the Midianite camp. Suddenly they blew the ram's horns, broke their clay jars. They held the torches in their left hands, the horns in their right hands, and they all shouted, a sword for the Lord and for Gideon. There was so much commotion that night, and confusion began to settle into the camp. Panic began to settle in. They turned, actually, as a result, they turned to each other. The enemy, the Midianites, began to turn to each other and started killing each other. Some of them that were not left, they ran and they went their way. And when all is said and done, people, it was a total rout for the Midianites and decisive victory for Gideon. Now here's 3 points from last week that I want to quickly just give it to you. Some spiritual principle we can learn from the life of this man Gideon as we continue in part B. Number 1 is this. Gideon did not sit around discussing or debating what he should do. He did not. He was a man of action. He came up with a plan and he went out and he did it. Innovative people do that. That is an innovation spirit. Sometimes we spend far too much time talking. We get caught up in the tiresome deliberations, wearisome meetings, endless committees, and the fatigue of going round and round and round and round the bush. Gideon heard the voice of the Lord. He knew what was expected of him. He did it. That's the spirit of innovation. So many people will question the decision of a leader. Has God spoken to you? Go do it. Quit organizing a couple of more committees. And the result was dramatic. That was the first lesson. He did not sit around. Second lesson that I learned about Gideon is this. Gideon did not go out of his way to look for what he needed in order to accomplish his assignment. He did not. What did he do? It's very interesting. He was actually then asking the question. Remember I mentioned that before? He did not ask, what do we need? You know what was his question? What do we have? That was his question. What do we... He used some commonplace things that could easily be get from the farm, from the family farm, from homes that they were representing there. He used, number 1, clay jars. He made torches and ram's horns. Homemade torches and ram's horns. He just used what was available to them right there. That's a spirit of innovation, because asking the question, what do we have? Not what do we need? Spirit of innovation. When you start with what you have, even if you don't have enough folks, that becomes a catalyst for innovation. What God asks of us is not some unusual equipment or tools to achieve His ends. He simply asks you folks, what do you have in your hands? Give it to me. Put it at my disposal. Let me use it through you to bless the lives of thousands of people. Here's the third point. Gideon did not sit back and commanded his troops to do what he said. In other words, he was not this armchair tactician. He identified himself intimately with his men. He was a frontline general. He was right there with them. He put his own reputation on the line, risking his very own life. That's the spirit of innovation. You know, if anyone assumes leadership among God's people, to be truly effective, you cannot hold yourself aloof from those who are fighting the battle in their struggle with sin, in their struggle with Satan, and in their own selves. A leader gets right into the trenches with their troops. That's the spirit of innovation. And as we build from that, as Gideon has won a decisive victory over the enemies, you think that that was the end of the story. That's a beautiful way to end the story of Gideon, but that wasn't the case. And this morning we're going to be talking about the power of attention. And it's a mixed feeling as we go through this. I'm just going to give you the verses, and I'm going to read and then just make some comments and some point on the power of attention. I mentioned before that it's not all of the destruction or anything else around us that get us off the course. It is the distraction of so many things, and that's why fasting and prayer is always good to introduce it into your life. Because so many distractions out there. And the power of attention teaches us this truth. Let me read to you chapter 8, verses 22 to 23. Then make some comments. The Israelites, remember now that they have won the victory? The Israelites say to Gideon, rule over us, you, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian. Verse 23. But Gideon told them, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Let me just give you a little context here. So far, under the leadership of Gideon, Israel have experienced overwhelming victory over the Midianites. There was tremendous excitement, exuberant enthusiasm sweeping across the land. The glory of victory and ecstasy of conquest filled the life of the camp. People were celebrating. People were dancing. But here's the problem. That the glory of victory and ecstasy of conquest have gone to their heads. And they could not handle success well. They wanted to make Gideon king. You know, in fact, if Gideon would have grabbed that opportunity, they would have made him king right there because they wanted him to be king. And notice what they said. You have saved us. That is so wrong. Careful about the spirit of success. You can get so distracted so easily. When they said that, Gideon, you have saved us, it was so wrong that they forgot it was God who won the battle for them. And so in the glory of the triumph, Israel got distracted. Here's the point. Success, if not managed well, will be a distractor from staying focused. How many stories we have seen, even in the ministry, that their lives have been destroyed. How quickly people forget that it was God who gave their leader Gideon the leadership ability and the expertise to execute amazing military strategy. How quickly they can forget. But in the glory of their triumph, they got so distracted. Instead of focusing on God, they focused on Gideon, their leader. They saw in him their hero, their hope, their possible first king. Distracted. No attention. Focused. Was gone. Success can do that to you. It does not matter whether you're a healthy person, wealthy, or whatever success that you may enjoy or experience. They saw in him that their attention had been so diverted from the God of their salvation to a mere man. How many people have translated the success to a mere man and not to God? That is a huge temptation in Christian ministry. I can tell you that I have followed so many great leaders that have been a mentor for me. I have seen and I watched them and I've seen how God has successfully blessed their ministry. I've listened to their speaking and the power of what they do. They just come there like, just the aura of their presence, and when they come in, and God has just anointed them. But I would never put my own focus on that person. A lot of people have helped me. A lot of leaders. But there are groups who literally idolize their leader. Because of pleasing personalities, maybe. And maybe because of a special charisma. Or maybe because of some outstanding gifts and abilities. They begin to be succumbed to the allurement of a successful pastor. And in doing well, in so doing, very often, listen, in doing that, so very often the Lord who granted the success is relegated to second place. Success can easily distract your focus. You know what the answer is? Quickly, prayer and fasting. Thankfully, Gideon did not succumb to their mass hysteria. Now, many of you can argue with me, was he genuine here? Because if you read the rest of the story. But what did he say? Gideon told them, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. Thankfully, he could have easily taken advantage of this opportunity and seized the sovereignty of his people, and the people could have gladly made him king. But he refused. I will not rule over, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will do that. Obviously, to some extent, success has not gone to his head. He had the spiritual maturity to recognize that it was God who granted us victory, people. And on this account, Gideon insisted that honor be given to whom honor is due. Wow. Now, the story began to turn. Had the historical record of Gideon concluded at this point, he would have stand securely as one of the most remarkable men in the annals of history, the history of Israel. But sadly, folks, his story did not end there. Like so many human narratives, it went on to disclose that, as with all of us, Gideon too had an Achilles heel in his makeup, or a weakness, or a vulnerable point. Here is a powerful leader who just said honor should be given where honor is due. We should not relegate him to the second place. Well, that is pretty powerful there, Gideon. Now listen to the story. Because now it's beginning to expose some Achilles heel, some weakness, some vulnerable point. Let me just digress a little bit. One of the most remarkable aspects of the scripture is that it does not make an attempt to whitewash people. It tells us like it is. whether it is Abraham or Moses, David or Hezekiah or Gideon. The scripture does not paint them as perfect people. Rather, we see them struggling in the light and shadows of their own unique makeup, striving against the assault of sin and selfishness, which, by the way, all of us face. So as with Gideon, he had this Achilles heel in his makeup that tarnished his great and noble triumph. Look at the scripture. And he said, I do have one request. Listen to this. After he just said that tremendous remark to his people, I do have one request, that each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder. And it was the custom of the Ishmaelites to wear gold earrings. They answered, we'll be glad to give them. So they spread out a garment, and each of them threw a ring from this plunder onto it. The weight of the gold rings he asked for came to 1,700 shekels, not counting the ornaments, the pendants, and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, or the chains that were on their camels' necks. What is happening here with our leader Gideon? Here's the second point. Not only success, materialism, if not managed well, will be a distraction from staying focused. What is Gideon's Achilles heel? Materialism. His heart was so great, very interesting to me, very interesting that his heart was not drawn away by the glitter of kingship, that he was ready to be crowned as king. He was not drawn away by that. But when it came to materialism, specifically gold, something deep inside of him awakened. An enormous, overpowering desire for sudden wealth, sudden security, sudden spending power engulfed this powerful leader, Gideon. He looked at all the gold and all the spoils of war and the precious elements his men had gathered as a result. He was mesmerized. I have never seen such wealth. There was this covetous craving for every gold earring he could lay his hands on. Oh, Gideon, why are you drifting so far? He told the men to gather all the golden earrings and ornaments and lay them in front of him. No one, in fact, no leader, no one asked Gideon, hey man, what are you going to do with that gold? Nobody asked him. In any case, he became an instant millionaire overnight. And unfortunately, it was to become his folly. Did you know that remember Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount? He warns people not to store up treasures for them on earth, but to store up treasures in heaven. Here's what he said. For where your treasure is, yes, gold, precious metal, gold. I don't really know what the price of gold is now on the stock. But such a precious commodity, if it not managed well, folks, can lead its owner into the prison of his own possessiveness. Materialism, be careful. It can distract your focus. Look at verse 27. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. This is if there's one saddest verse in the Bible, this is it. Gideon made the gold into an ephod, which he placed in Ophrah, his town. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshiping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. That is a sad verse. Now, what is an ephod? It's very interesting he mentioned the word ephod, because it tells you something about this man. And here's, before I share with you what an ephod is, here's the third principle you can learn that will help us to stay focused. Not only success will distract you, materialism will distract you. Your heart, if it's not managed well, will be a distraction. In Proverbs chapter 4, verse 23, Solomon, the wisest man, said this: above all else, guard your heart. Why? For everything you do flows from it. Guard your heart. Husband and wife, husbands, guard your heart. Wives, guard your heart. I think those are powerful statements given by a man, because here's the thing. You, above all else, you guard your heart. In other words, pay attention to what is going on. Pay attention to what's going on inside your heart. And begin to protect that which is valuable. Defend your heart. Your ability to feel a certain thing is determined by the condition of your heart. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do will flow from it. All kinds of things that comes out of our actions actually flows from our heart. We are defiled by what it is in our heart, and not simply by what we do. Everything we do flows from your heart. So Gideon, you should be guarding your heart. And if your heart is not in a good shape, listen, if your heart is not in a good shape, it's going to be impossible to maintain focus and attention. For out of it flows the issues of life. And Gideon did something that was so naive and foolish. He made an ephod out of the gold that he collected. Again, now what is an ephod? Here's a picture. An ephod actually is a garment that is worn by the priest, by the high priest. And exclusively it is a garment that is used by the high priest when he goes into the tabernacle, in the temple. And he wears this blue tunic, fabric worn, and attached to the shoulder, you see, is plates, and attached to these straps with the names of all the 12 tribes that are on this. As the high priest ministered before God, interceding for his nation, he presented all the names of his people to God, because that's what the priest is, to represent his people to God. And by the way, it is another additional to this. During this period in Israel's history, the home of the Ark of the Covenant and the high priest was in Shiloh, which is closer to Jerusalem. It was only there, it was only in Shiloh that the high priest could minister on behalf of all his people before God. And what is Gideon doing? He knew this, and so did his family and friends. Somehow the gold now in his possession induced him to do this very naive and foolish thing. To put it bluntly, Gideon simply substituted one form of false worship with another. Do you remember back in chapter 6, remember he was told to demolish the power of the false gods of Baal and the Ashtaroth? Which he did. What is he doing now? He's just substituting one form of false worship with another. This would have been so serious enough had it only involved his own immediate family. But that was not the case. The tragedy was it involved all of his nation. The whole of Israel was led astray by one man's decision. It's worth mentioning here that the responsibility of moral or spiritual leadership, we bear that. It's an enormous burden for any man to bear. It takes a continuous, ongoing, undeviating devotion, attention to God to lead others to the right path. huge temptation in Christian ministry to have our attention focused on that which ourselves have produced and taken upon ourselves in false honor. Gideon fashioned an ephod of gold, and it became a snare to him, his family, his friend, and his entire nation. Captivated their attention, took them away from focusing their faith in God, all because Gideon failed to guard his heart. And so he was distracted. It essentially became Gideon's downfall. That decision he made, that golden ephod stood as a constant reminder of his own glittering achievement. In fact, listen, it dimmed his clear view and memory of the Lord who had met him under the oak tree as he was threshing wheat in the winepress and took him like a tool in a master craftsman's hand and did something beautiful and powerful out of his life. He forgot all of that. When Gideon died, his body was sealed. And I want to end with that. Listen to the sad ending of this story of Gideon. You know when he died, by the way, before he died, because he was a millionaire by this time, he went back to his own home in Ophrah. I mean, it's amazing what money can do. He got himself all of these wives and concubines. He had 70 sons and all of these other things. But what I wanted to close the time when he died. When he died, they put his body in the sepulchre and sealed it. It was like closing the door on a glorious chapter in the annals of Israel. Gideon's influence for good and for God, his majestic magnetism, his unique charisma, his leadership and uplift of his wayward people, sadly all were buried with him. His devotion to God and his faith in the God of his forefathers was a facet of his life that seemed to have failed to make an enduring impact on the nation of Israel. And because soon after his death, soon after, the people plunged back into the darkness of Baal and Ashtaroth worship. It was as if he, Gideon, almost had never been on the center stage of this strange nation's sad and painful history. That's the price of not being focused. And the story of Gideon, the hero of Israel, ended up in tragedy. The Bible tells us, we shared that the other night. Paul said to Timothy in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 7, fight the good fight, Timothy, so that you can end well. Be a good finisher. It's not about finishing, but being a good finisher of the faith. Fight the good fight. But folks, Gideon was a man who, in his finest hour, brought great glory not only to himself, his family, and his nation, also to his God. Let's give him that credit. But by the same measure, he was also a man who, in his weaker moments, perpetrated great folly not only for himself, but also for those who followed him. He leaves us with a classic, clear-cut picture of one who knew what it was to walk humbly with his God in greatness. He leaves us also with a solemn, sobering view of a man who misses the mark when his personal preferences overruled God's gracious will for his life. And he did not finish well. And I want to close with a verse that brings us to the power of attention. And I will close with this verse. In Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 to 3. Here's what the writer said. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. Fixing our eyes on Jesus, In a moment, Pastor John is going to lead us in the Lord's Supper. But this phrase, fixing our eyes on Jesus, really is a negative phrase in Greek. It literally means, let us turn away to Jesus. Turn away to Jesus. The idea is we are focusing on something else other than Jesus. Now let us turn our attention away from those things and focus and fasten our attention on Jesus, the author and perfecter of our faith. That is the only way we can stay focused and attentive. Who for the joy set before him endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. The implication is that Jesus Christ willingly chose to die for me. He put off what was rightly his in order to die for people, for a person like me, for a nutcase like me, to send the message throughout eternity. I care for you, Todd. I love you, brother. I see your pain. I was aware of your sin. I know your problems. I died for you because of you. And that should settle once for all my care, my concern, and my faithfulness for you. Do you know what fixing our eyes on Jesus is? It is the only hope for enduring faith, because only as we fix our eyes on Jesus and only as we discover the significance of the cross, that we find the competence in ourselves to say, I don't understand what is happening around me. It doesn't make any sense. It looks as if God has forgotten all about me. But if someone would freely choose to die for me, I know they have my best interest in mind. And I know that I can trust them. My brothers and sisters, heed to the word of the Hebrew. Fix our eyes this year on Jesus, who is not only the foundation of the author of your faith, but the perfecter of your faith, which means someday the heavens will open, the trumpet will sound, and the day will come when we will be ushered in the presence of the Almighty, when there will be no more pain, no more reason to guard your heart. There's no more other things that will distract you, because you're in the presence of the one who died for you.